Hello, my name is Sadaf. Welcome to another episode with Reflection. Today I have a special guest, my mentor, my facilitator in CI, Dr. Luke Siniewski. Dr. Luke is a compassionate inquiry facilitator, mentor, and practitioner, blending his experience in somatic therapy, well-being coaching to help clients achieve authenticity and inner peace. Holding a PhD in psychology, he specializes in trauma healing, core belief, and an integration of somatic practices and psychedelic-assisted therapy. He's the author of Soma Wise and a teacher guided by pioneers such as Gabor Mate. Currently, he's also leading workshops and therapeutic sessions globally. Welcome, Luke. Thank you for being here.
That's really lovely to be here, Sadaf, and thank you for the lovely intro. It's nice to be described in that way. It makes me sound more important than I really am, but thank you.
Wow. We take on roles, right? And you are pretty significant in my life as a therapist and as a human, and you have always taught me a lot, and I have learned a lot from you. So yeah, it's precious to have this connection with you.
Yeah, it's precious to be sharing this time, and hopefully we can explore and unpack things that might be useful and helpful for others as well.
Yeah, thank you. So Luke, the way I know you is through CI, and for those that know me, they're pretty familiar with compassionate inquiry, which we call CI. You were my mentor, and you still are my mentor. I keep coming to you for sessions and guidance, and yeah, mentoring me. What drew you to CI?
You know, the thing that drew me to CI is I've always been somewhat of a somatic guy. I've always been connected to the body in some way. So started in professional athletics, went on to start a career focusing on the body as a personal trainer, massage therapist, nutritionist. But the longer I stayed in the helping industry, the more my interests started to go inward, and I realized that I was becoming more of a therapist and a coach for my clients rather than someone that was simply supervising their workouts or taking care of their soft tissue. And it was then that I started seeing that, wow, this thing called change is actually possible because of this relationship that was forming with clients, not simply, again, the exercise or the diet. And so I just kept going in and realizing, hey, there's actually more to the body, more to change than just, like I said, these superficial practices. It drew me to meditation, drew me to other aspects of the body, like cold exposure, contrast therapy, those sorts of things. But what was always lacking for me was a language on how to bridge the gap between those somatic practices and empowering people to do that for themselves and understanding what's actually happening when we do connect to our body in this unique way and in this interoceptive felt sense way. And CI gave me the language to do that. So it was probably, it still is, it was the only certification that I did to only learn because I was so immensely interested in what Dr. Gabor Mate had to share and his approach and with helping others. So I just dove in and started learning and experimenting on myself. It's a beautifully structured program, as you know. And it gave me, again, it gave me that language. All of a sudden, I could speak from the body. And not just that, but have a language and a method that gently guided clients back to their felt sense rather than simply doing, hey, let's do this exercise. Hey, let's do this thing. It was more like a spontaneous revealing that, oh, look, it's like, oh, look, you're already in the body and you didn't even know it. And I didn't put you there. It's because of CI's way of asking questions that we sort of the client doesn't even realize that they're gently walking back towards themselves until, wow, there they are, feeling something that they thought they didn't have access to.
Yeah, how beautiful is that? And then how engaging in that process and being part of CI, because I assume you started as a participant, like
They just made me facilitator right away. No, you know, one of the things that happens, like I have noticed, and maybe you and others would relate to this, if we're doing something just to get the credential or just to check the box, we don't engage with it as deeply. We don't really allow ourselves to be fully immersed in the content.
Mhm.
And because I had sort of dismissed, like in my mind, I wasn't going to be a CI facilitator. It wasn't even remotely on my like bandwidth or possibilities in life. And so I just really dove into the process and I cracked myself open like a nut voluntarily, really allowed myself to be immersed in the pain, in the beauty, in the challenge, in the freedom of it all. And it wasn't until the end of the year-long training after I was like, great, great. I got everything I needed from this. I'm ready to come back into my life. And then my facilitator sent me a very random email and said, "Hey, would you like to be an intern? Would you like to intern?" And I remember exactly where I was at. I was doing a hike with my wife and a few of our friends, and I showed her the email, and we both looked at each other like surprised. We're like, should I say yes? Should I say yes? I didn't know what to do. And so I said yes, and thankfully I did because, a certain thing, I think we can get trained as therapists. I think that we can train a lot of our skills. I think that we can improve as therapists, surely. But I also believe that certain people are more geared for this work than others,
Mhm.
and certain people are more geared for CI specific work as opposed to other modalities like CBT or ACT or relational or psychoanalytic, whatever it may be. But I do feel like the way that I see the world and see the body, that it was like a perfect fit with CI. So I haven't felt like anything other than, wow, this has been such a natural fit. And I'm very lucky to have stumbled. Everyone says, oh, wow, you stumble upon the career you're meant to do. I actually do feel that I'm just doing what I was here to do through CI.
Exactly. And I think that's kind of the beauty of what CI teaches us to once we become in alignment with our true self, then we don't need to try doing. We just become whatever needs to happen and unfold. So you briefly talked about it, how CI has affected you. So my question is how CI has affected you personally, like in your personal life. Because when I did the year-long professional training, I was a different person at the end of the year. It tremendously changed me. And then I'll ask you later how you witnessed me go through this, but I want to know how your experience was for your personal life.
The word that best describes that process is personal responsibility.
Mhm.
Because once you accept that tenant, once you really understand that, hey, this thing called life, you don't control the things that happen to you, but you can control your responses. And through CI, if you're curious about those reactions that are getting in the way of your responses, you can go find out where they came from. And so, in terms of my personal life, well, once you open Pandora's box, you can't close it. You can't put things back in. So then you're like, okay, well, shit. I know that this is all my responsibility. So if there's tension in this relationship, or if there's a reaction emerging within myself, if there's discord or disharmony or something happening in this relationship with my wife or my son or even my clients, then I know that that's mine. That's mine to own and mine to explore. And it's been so empowering to do that. Of course, challenging because no one really wants to look in the mirror, or they say they do, but when it's time to look in the mirror, it can be quite challenging to do that. And CI has just been this consistent, constant invitation to continue refining, not just the looking in the mirror, but to really get curious and zoom in and see, well, what are these things that I may have not seen about myself and before?
Mhm.
And through these relationships in my everyday life, through the lens of CI, it means that all of these relationships and people and contexts are just showing me aspects of myself that need to be explored and discovered and held and integrated.
Yeah, yeah. That's exactly how it is. Meaning we can never lie to ourselves. Once we see it, then that's
Yes.
it. Yeah. I always admired when I come to you with questions about clients or something that I need guidance with for my personal work too. You always act like a very direct mirror to me. Like you always put it back on me, which I really it's a good challenge. Sometimes I'm like, oh, it's so challenging, but um being that mirror, it's so important, and I always am grateful for having you as that reflection. How have you been seeing me going through CI? And I'm not looking for for
You want me to celebrate you?
yeah, I'm not looking for
I'm
any
going to tell you how good you're doing, Siddha.
because people when people see me as a therapist, they have a lot of gratitude and admiration a lot of times, and they think that I'm this great person that got their shit together.
Well, can I just interrupt and start
Of
answering
course.
all of that?
Yeah,
What
yeah.
what they don't see is all the work you put in to do that. It takes a lot of work to begin to, firstly, it takes a lot of work just to turn around and look this way instead of looking this way. It's a lot easier to live unconsciously, finger pointing and blaming. It's a lot harder to turn around, and that process is painful, and to look inward and get curious. And oftentimes, and I think this is a common experience for people that have done the work, they have people around them saying, "Wow, how are you so still?" Or "How do you have your stuff together?" Like they notice these qualities. What they don't see is the journey to get there.
Mhm.
And what I've appreciated, and I appreciate this about th therapists who do the work themselves, because that's also the minority. It's not all the therapists that do the work themselves. For someone like you have to, what I always appreciate is your capacity to be open to feedback, right? It doesn't matter what I give. If I'm giving you a gift, you
Mm.
still have to take that gift, receive it, open it, and look inside, because I can give all I want. But if you don't receive it, if you don't do something with it, then it doesn't matter. So to watch someone be not just curious about the gift they're receiving, but to open it and appreciate it. And it may not always be a pleasant gift or a pleasant experience to receive it, but what you do with it, it can transform us. And I think you've been an absolute witness of that, or testament to that.
Yeah. Well, yeah. That's yeah. That's I always admire how before every session you're like, how would you like to receive feedback? I'm like, give it to me.
I love, well, and there's a lesson in that, right? Because we know if we're in relationship with someone, it's not just us in relationship. There's also our conditionings that are in relationship with each other.
Yes.
And if you really want the person in front of you to receive what you have to say, you better get permission. So this oftentimes, and my guess is all of your clients, all of your listeners, they don't like receiving unsolicited advice. No one likes to be told what to do. So
Exactly.
as a therapist, if we really want to give the client something, then
Mhm.
we have to make sure that they're in a position to receive it, that their nervous system is actually opening towards you rather than being closed off and defensive. So there's a lot of usefulness in that question, not just in a dynamic like this, but in a parent-child dynamic, in a spouse-to-spouse dynamic. Hey, I'd like to share something with you. Is it okay for me to share it?
Yeah.
Just that is such an invitation because it empowers the other person, gives them the possibility of saying no. And that is okay for them to say.
Mhm.
But if they say yes, as soon as they say yes, that already invites that engagement. Of course, it takes some skill to navigate conversations like that, but at least a nice starting point to that conversation is seeking permission and seeking consent.
Yes, that's a life skill, regardless of therapeutic or like you said. Can we ask for permission before we just
Yeah.
go out? So that's a beautiful segue to the next question I had about the beliefs and how we are as humans. In your book, which you generously gifted to me, Soma Wise, you talk about core beliefs and how do core beliefs form in our life and how do they affect us and life experience? Yeah.
So here's a little update for you. The updated version of Somawise will be coming out in the coming months. And
Oh,
so as it does come out, maybe there's a bit of a refinement around the topic of core beliefs. So maybe this will be new to you as I share it with you. Because a core belief, because it's coming from the mind, it's a story, it's a label. And this is important because some people and clients, particularly, may never in their life have a core belief. Because in order to have a core belief, we have to be curious. We have to look backwards. We have to say, hey, why is this thing happening in my life all the time? Why do I find myself in the same cycle? When we ask ourselves why and we get curious with the assistance through teachers, through therapists, whatever it may be, and then we start to look backwards. And then we look at our behaviors and we say, what's the best way to explain why I always did that, why I always prioritized others, why I did this thing, why I didn't show my emotions, why all these why questions. And all of a sudden, the mind, because the mind is really incredible at understanding and analyzing and doing those kinds of tasks, it looks at that and says, oh my God, I must have believed that I wasn't good enough, or I was unworthy, or I was unlovable, because how else would you explain that?
Mhm. Mhm.
And this is actually a really important starting point for exploring beliefs, the confrontation with this possibility or this feeling, right? This feeling of fundamental lack. If we stopped there, I think the journey of core beliefs would be incomplete
Mhm.
because I don't think that tells the whole story. Yes, I think you and I, and probably many listeners who have gone down the journey of personal growth, can probably relate to those words, I'm not good enough. I could certainly relate to that belief for a very large portion of my adult life, and maybe even my late adolescence and teenage years for sure. And if I wasn't cognitively thinking it, I was definitely living that way, if that makes sense.
Mhm.
But if we tracked back to a 3-year-old, imagine a 3-year-old who is prioritizing the environment, their parents, in order to survive. We wouldn't walk up to that 3-year-old and say, you're such a people pleaser. You must not believe you're good enough. Is that the truth? Right? Because this 3-year-old, there's a biological inclination for this child to seek safety, to seek connection, to seek belonging. Because without belonging to a community, that mammal, that child will die, right? So here's this genetic programming. It's built into our instincts and our adaptive strategies that we have to maintain connection. We have to maintain attachment with our immediate environment or we die. And it's essential. It's a biological imperative.
Okay.
And we do this unconsciously. It's not like the 3-year-old is sitting there pondering, should I be authentic or should I maintain attachment in this situation?
Mhm.
Nothing like that happens. It's
Mhm.
an unconscious impulse and drive towards survival. That is at the core of it. It's not a mental process. I hope I'm being clear on this
Yeah.
distinction.
Yeah.
But here's the thing. As we're driven towards belonging, we start developing behaviors in order to maintain that belonging.
Mhm.
And those behaviors early on, practiced and repeated over time, they begin to form our personality.
Mhm.
And over time, that personality and those behaviors begin to form a lifestyle, a routine, a way of being in the world. And over time, as we become adults, all of a sudden we've created an entire worldview based on this unconscious impulse towards attachment.
Mhm.
And there's a lot of benefit, especially at the beginning, because if a child is unconsciously attaching, they're surviving. So anyone listening, guess what? All those mechanisms, they worked because you're alive today. For some people, and not everyone again, and we can talk about scenarios where it may not be the case, but the benefit of unconsciously maintaining attachment sometimes starts getting less than the pain of suppressing authenticity,
Mhm.
right? So if the benefit of maintaining unconsciously attaches up here and the pain always stays down here, guess what? This person's never going to be introspective.
Yeah.
This person's completely happy to be unconscious and it works for them. There's and get this, there's nothing wrong with that either. It's not like we're trying to say you have to be authentic. No, like we're all here to experience duality in its all the unique ways. So some people just they have no calling for it, they have no interest in it. Okay.
Yeah.
For others, however, again, maybe those that are interested in this path, so my guess is many of your listeners, all of a sudden maintaining attachment, like trying to people please, trying to make everyone happy other than yourself, the benefit starts going down.
Mhm.
And the pain of neglecting yourself, the pain of pushing down who you actually are starts growing. And here comes that breaking point. And all of a sudden we say, why? Why am I doing this? Why does this keep happening to me? And if that pain of suppressing authenticity keeps going up and the benefit of maintaining unconscious attachment continues to go down, eventually we will have that reflection. Eventually we will go backwards in time. And eventually we will label ourselves as not good enough only because we don't understand that those behaviors were actually survival mechanisms the whole time.
Mhm.
But, and this is also important, why is it that when we look back, do we say, I'm not good enough instead of man, I was so good at belonging. Look how well I survived. We don't say that, do we? We always say the negative. We say the limiting version of that belief. We say, I'm not worthy, I'm not lovable, I'm not good enough. And I think there's also a reason for that. Firstly, is because the things that the mind doesn't understand that are uncertain, unknown, labels it in a negative way. Things that the mind finds experiences as uncomfortable, they must be bad. So notice that when we start touching the pain of our suppressed authenticity, we start touching experiences that are unknown and uncomfortable and unpleasant, the mind will naturally label something that is outside of its control, uncomfortable and unpleasant. The mind will naturally label it as, no, I'm not going there. That must be a bad thing. It must be a self-destructive habit. It must be a self-destructive belief. It must be a limiting belief. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Yeah.
And so it makes sense that as a starting point, when we're unaware of the need to survive, then of course our starting point might be, well, I must not be good enough. But if we stop there, I think we don't complete that journey of understanding, hey, you know what? This is a fundamental human mammalian thing.
Mm.
And and this is why it's also important. When we recognize its fundamental protective nature, these behaviors that formed who we are, when we understand the fundamental reason they arose, we relate to it differently. And this
Mhm.
is how you actually move beyond it. Because if you judge it as limiting, self-destructive, you're essentially telling that little kid who's been protecting you her life, you're saying, get away. I don't want you here. Get away. I don't want you here. Instead of saying, hey, I see you. You had to do that to survive. You've been
Mhm.
protecting me this whole time. Thank you.
Mhm.
Thank you for all that you've done for me. Thank you for serving me continuously, tirelessly. Because look, I'm alive today because of you.
Mhm.
And all of a sudden it changes the way we shift, the way we move, the way we open to that experience. And now let's go back to what we just shared at the beginning. When we talked about gift giving, and I said, hey, would you like this gift? And you said, yes, your nervous system opens to it.
Mhm.
If we say yes to that core belief, when we say yes to that, you know what? Yes, there was a part of me that had to belong. All of a sudden, there's more openness towards that. And that's when we are allowed to fully heal from it. It's not the intellectual understanding,
Mhm.
it's allowing the experience to pass through our body and letting ourselves feel authenticity that's been suppressed, most likely, not just this generation, but several generations, right?
Mhm.
This surely doesn't start with us. This goes back.
Yeah. And this is another point that you keep repeating, or the message that you're trying to convey in your book, to come from the mind to the body. And I guess
Yes.
the title of the book, Soma Wise, I don't know if you name it after the person or you're trying to say the Soma is wise.
Yes, exactly. Soma wise, Soma wisdom, body wisdom, really. It's really just a way of saying there's wisdom in our body that
Yeah.
is beyond thought, which is
Mhm.
why it's so interesting. Think about the phenomenon of, have you heard of the phrase, or you have to learn to accept things, like you have to accept things, right?
Mhm.
And that's just the mind's, or that particular mind's, best description of a process it can't do.
Mhm.
And this is why the mind has a lot of different words and why different teachers have different words. We call it surrendering, observing, witnessing, leaning in, allowing, accepting, being mindful, holding. Again, look how many words are describing a very similar process, because the mind is always dancing around this thing that it just can't get to,
Yeah.
because feeling is something only the body can do.
Mhm.
And so the mind hates it because the mind wants to do it. The mind wants to be able to do it, but it can't.
Yeah.
And this is what
Mhm.
frustrates it. So it brings a semblance of control. So for me, it doesn't matter what word you use. Whatever word or concept or teaching, this is why it's so great that there's millions of different teachers and teachings out there that are talking about the same thing. There's no right one. Whichever one allows the receiver of the teaching to tune in, stay, hold, again, I'm making up words because you just do your best to describe it, to witness as the body does its own thing without the mind intruding. And I
Mhm.
don't care what does it, as long as it's doing that, I think we're moving in the right direction for holistic healing.
Mhm. Mhm. Yes, because the mind thinks it can bypass the emotions by thinking about it, criticizing it, rationalizing, judging, and all of those things. But then once we become embodied in the experience, then there is really nothing that can argue with that because it's what we're feeling.
Yes.
Mhm.
As you know from Michael Brown's book, The Presence Process, the only way out is through.
True. Mhm.
And one way, and this is not to discredit the role and function of the mind. And this is also not a demonization of the mind, because imagine being in a dark room. You have no idea what the hell is going on. That's a very confusing, challenging situation for anyone, to be stuck and locked in a dark room.
Oh,
When we turn on a light, wow, that's the mind. Look, I see everything. I understand everything. Now I see what I'm dealing with.
mm,
But the room, when you turn on a light in a dark room and you see a huge mess, turning on the light doesn't clean up the mess.
exactly.
And so the mind turns on the light, but you still have to do the work. And that's where the work with the body comes in, because the body has to move at its own pace, because turning on a light is instantaneous, right?
Mhm.
It's there.
Yeah.
But for the body to do the work of healing and integrating and processing some of these old conditioned reactions deeply embedded in our nervous system and our body, well, that's a very different process. And I'd like to say, it takes time, but it doesn't necessarily, it takes time, but it doesn't necessarily move linearly, right? It moves
Mhm.
all over the
Yeah.
place, but it's not necessarily like it takes time like this. It takes time like this or whatever,
Yeah.
So, but
I
it
guess
does take
that
some space.
I guess that's another mind expectation for things to be linear. That's another
Yeah.
mind story.
The mind story that it's linear, that it's fast and it's immediate. And if we based our progress, and this is probably true for everyone, if they can reflect on any goal they've moved towards, any intention, they've probably always been surely disappointed in themselves, because the mind's expectations are always way too lofty. And yet, if we looked at it from the perspective of the body can never experience failure, because the body's always just moving in that direction. So even if it moves a little, the body's like, sweet, I shifted. There's
Mhm.
no, there's no, there's no comparison. It's just, look, something moved, something shifted. And so again, might it be important that we're compassionate with ourselves as we journey through change, which is one of the hardest things we engage in life? I would say, yeah, I think it's important to be compassionate to ourselves as we move through the process of change.
Yeah, of course, of course. Another thing that I always quote from you is the mind tells you a story and the body tells you the truth. I really like that one because, and it's not, like you said, it's not to discredit the mind, because without cognition, like we couldn't be where we are. Like imagine every morning trying to make coffee and then you have to relearn how to grind coffee and how to do things. So we need the mind, but it's just that it gets out of balance and we give too much power to the
Yeah,
mind.
it's living solely in the mind that becomes a challenge, because then we're not really engaging with reality.
Mhm.
We're engaging with our imaginations. We're
Mhm.
engaging with memories, with expectations, rather than seeing the person in front of us, seeing ourselves more clearly, but seeing life. So Somawise is an invitation to, again, if we've been solely living in the mind, it might be helpful to spend some time in the body. I think that there's a natural balance between the two. And in fact, one of the central tenets of the book is that when the body is full of tension and stress and constriction, the state of the mind is agitated.
Mhm.
It's quick-tempered, it's dysregulated, it can't focus.
Mhm.
And this one of the nice experiments is this. Anyone that's gone to get a massage, after the massage, when the tension of their body has been released, they feel very relaxed in their mind. They have more clarity, they have more calmness. And yet their mind didn't do anything during the massage. What happened was a physical release of the body, which releases different chemicals, endorphins. It's immensely therapeutic to receive massage and touch.
Mhm.
And so this is the unique thing, that when we begin to take care of the body, treat it, be a humble servant to the body and give it what it needs, all of a sudden the mind becomes freer to actually be creative, to reach its potential, to be utilized as a tool rather than us being a slave of our mind, because that's what tends to happen.
Mhm.
When the mind is running the show and it's constantly ruminating, all of a sudden, well, we're just stuck in a reactive cycle, like a ball in a pinball machine bouncing off everywhere, which direction. And it's nice that actually when we take care of the body, it frees up the mind to do its thing. Then we can really have fun with life as conscious creators rather than unconscious reactors.
Yes. Oh, I love that. Thank you for that. You mentioned these somatic practices like meditation, cold exposure, and also I know that you work, or there's part of psychedelic work in what you have to offer. How can psychedelics facilitate getting into the body, and
Well,
potentially going beyond the beliefs and the critics and all of those
yeah.
things?
Yeah. So, a bit around this topic because it's emerging all over the world, interest, a renewed interest and therapeutic interest in this. I do think, firstly, before we even start the discussion, that I'm not a big believer in psychedelics as a recreational drug. So I think, as Michael Pollan says in his documentary, in his book, drugs are wasted on the youth. Psychedelics are wasted on the youth because they're powerful. Um, they can catalyze change in ways that only those somatic practices can. So if we imagine, and this is again something that's more relatable than not, imagine someone's mind, which is so rigid and set in its ways that no matter what, that person or client is unable to attend to their feelings, can't feel their feelings, is always numb, is always the defenses, that self-protective mechanism is so strong that no matter the practice, no matter the direction, they always end up in their mind. And this is true for so many. And this is what actually invited me back to the psychedelic world because I did ayahuasca in Peru in 2015. And then I did Vipassana meditation, 10-day silent meditation a few months later. And after Vipassana, I said, well, I'll never need to do psychedelics again because I just got there with meditation. And this is a practice that is more permanent. And I agree it is. You have more clarity. I agree because there's no substance. You're just there. And so I was like, great. So for years, I was just meditating. I'm like, wow, here's all the benefits that people talk about with psychedelics. I don't need them. But then as I became more fully developed as a therapist and I started appreciating that, you know what? Not everyone is able to meditate, commit to meditation, and do the practice to the depth and degree that I did. And what does that mean? That I'm just supposed to stop and say, well, then good luck. You can't change. I said, no, there has to be other ways to take this mind and make it a little looser rather than being stuck in that rigidity. And of course, now I work with a few medicines, but these medicines, depending on context, depending on a lot of different things to consider, because medical safety is such an important part of the journey. But in certain contexts, psychedelics can take this rigid mind and open it up.
Mhm.
And then again, as psychedelics get popular, some people think it's the magic bullet, that it's the cure. It's not in any way, shape, or form.
Mhm.
All I can say is that when the mind gets loosened and we have physiological changes in the brain and the body that happen as a result of these medicines, now we can sneak in.
Mhm.
And now we can sneak in and start with the real change. So the real journey of change doesn't happen during the psychedelic journey, but after the psychedelic journey, which isn't an addictive journey like some people think. It's a very challenging, oftentimes very challenging journey where someone is confronted with somatic experiences that they were avoiding unconsciously, with with memories that they were repressing, with insights that were always just beyond reach. And all
Mhm.
of a sudden, all of this wisdom becomes accessible and embodied during a psychedelic journey. And now the potential for change grows because the rigidity is loosened. And now maybe we've got that hope, that glimmer of possibility to say, now we can start the practices, the therapeutic journey, the process of starting to build a different way forward rather
Mhm.
than being rigidly stuck in the old ways. So I think psychedelics does provide a potential pathway for something that would be otherwise inaccessible.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And absolutely, as practitioners that work with psychedelics, one of our jobs is harm reduction and make sure that we don't give this false message of, oh, psychedelics the cure.
Yes.
Because absolutely, it's also not for everybody. Like if your nervous system is not ready and prepared to receive the messages, then that could be quite disorienting.
Yeah.
So
The
then,
psychedelic, oh, please.
mhm. Sorry, go ahead.
No, the psychedelic journey starts with preparation, right?
Yeah,
So
that's what I was
the
gonna
the
say.
the preparation, integration, and in the middle somewhere is the actual journey in the medicine. But you start taking the psychedelic weeks, months before when you start the practices and you start the investigation, because this is even in a psychedelic journey, this can get in the way. So if there's unresolved fears or unexplored fears or hesitancies or doubts, if we're not exploring those, guess what's going to pop up? The first thing that's going to pop up in a psychedelic journey are those fears and those doubts. This is why we want the mind. We want the mind as our ally. The mind is not our enemy, it's our friend. It's like, hey, let's make sure your mind understands what's about to happen, because it's going to be a very unique experience. To have someone who's been living rigidly in the mind with a sense of perceived control. Of course, it's not accurate, but a sense of perceived control their whole life, all of a sudden to have their sense of reality and control shifted, whew, that can be a very challenging experience.
Yeah, yeah. And would you say that we can use CI for preparation for a psychedelic experience and integration and these somatic practices that you're talking about?
You know, there's many modalities that have been linked with psychedelics. I think IFS is one of the few that have been sort of intertwined and interlinked with psychedelics for good reason, because psychedelics allows us to access different parts. But I would say CI is absolutely along the same within the same realm of efficiency, effectiveness. And I went through my professional training for psychedelics, and a large majority of it was a bit redundant and repetitive, and it wasn't new information for me, because you know the first thought that just kept coming up during the professional training with psychedelics was, I learned all of this in CI. In fact, CI is diving into these qualities and this way of actually showing up for someone, right? Because one of the core aspects of psychedelics is to honor the client's inner healing intelligence. You know, that's just fancy words for saying trust the client's body, trust the client's experiences exactly as it's supposed to be. And CI gives us that language and a rigorous, intensive experience and training and learning how to not just attend to the client's experience in a way that honors their process, but also in a way to our own experience, so it doesn't unconsciously interfere with the other person's process. So these are two things we're holding. This is why, if you haven't done the work as a therapist, and certainly as a psychedelic facilitator, I don't think anyone should be serving the medicine who hasn't done the medicine and who hasn't done the work and understands what's happening within themselves, because they have to be able to hold their own space as they're holding the space for someone else.
Oh yeah. And one of the biggest things that CI teaches us is to get out of the way.
Yeah.
We need to
I love
just
that.
get out of the way and let trust the client's process and be attuned to them, be present, and just be witness.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And there's a lot of power to that when we do that. And it's not like it's also, you know, something that might be interesting to note is it's not a witnessing presence that doesn't know what to do, or like confused, or like, I'm just going to not do anything. It's not what's happening. It's a knowing that it's a knowingness that this is going exactly where it's meant to. And what's on the other side of this thing is going to be something that's pretty remarkable and beautiful. And I can sit here trusting that we are moving in that direction, knowing that we're moving in that direction.
Yes, yes. And I learned that from you. Thank you for making that clarification. I remember one time I came to you and like, I really don't know what to do with this person. And you're like, sit with them in the shit. I'm like, oh, okay. So, and that,
Yes.
yeah, that's been powerful. Because
Yeah.
again, it's another mind thing. Oh my gosh, what should I do? Nothing, just be, and then trust that it's going to be okay, because
Yeah.
their inner intelligence knows.
Yeah. I mean, you have to understand that shit that we're feeling, that we're trying to talk them out of and trying to fix them, that's their experience as well. So we need to sit with them and show them that it's okay for us to be here as well.
Yeah, yeah,
So, yeah.
yeah. And that's another, the last thing I'm going to say, because you talk about the conscious discomfort in the book. And I
Mm.
guess that's kind of the message. It's going to be uncomfortable, but it's okay that it's uncomfortable, and we can get
Yeah.
through this.
Yeah, there's no way of preparing for the real pain of life, right? Because it happens unknowingly out of nowhere. It's not like we can wake up and say, okay, at 12:07 today I'm going to get triggered, so I should probably prepare for that in some way. It just happens. And in fact, we probably get triggered if we're paying attention. We get triggered all the time.
Yeah.
And conscious discomfort practice is just a way of consciously inviting discomfort into our present moment experience, so we can practice holding it, so we can practice being observant and okay with it. So it's not governing our decision making and our reactions. So again, things like meditation, breath work, yoga, exercise, all these different practices that allow us to take our attention inward and just observe. And the only thing I will say about conscious discomfort practices is it's not just about doing it. It's not like going underneath a cold shower, which is can be a very therapeutic practice, and closing your eyes, okay, 30 seconds, and just like, "Oh, I'm going to get through it." That's not what we're talking about because you're still reacting to it. Conscious discomfort is it's how you do the practice that's important. It's firstly, where's my attention? Because if my attention is here, I'm not doing the practice in a way that's transformative. So we want to really be paying attention to our body. This is why sometimes exercise, when we're blasting music or listening to podcasts, great, go for it. You're getting some physical benefits. But the actual psychological transformational benefits, well, then work out in silence, work out a little more slowly, pay attention to the body, and now you're using it as a way to connect to yourself. Great. The second aspect is to soften into the experience, right? Like I said, you can tense against a cold shower or you can relax into it and wait. Let's wait for my body to really soften and stop resisting. That's what we're looking for because this is why it's important. When we learn how to soften into an experience that's uncomfortable and we feel it in our body, like we can feel the difference between this and this, when we begin to feel that, all of a sudden that becomes accessible to us in everyday life because then you can't bullshit. Am I accepting right now or am I not accepting? You might say, yep, I'm accepting this. I'm accepting this. Well, let's look at the body. Is your body tensing? Is your body fighting? Because if it is, you're not actually accepting this experience. And if we don't have that experiential reference point to lean on, we actually don't know when the hell we're accepting or if we're accepting. So I do appreciate the power of the practices to show us those kinds of things.
It's literally a different nervous system state that we go in
Absolutely.
when we're resisting or we
Yes. Yes. Speaking of which, you can be in pain and not triggered. You can be uncomfortable and not dysregulated,
Yes.
right? So there's a huge difference, and it all has to do with our level of softening and allowing and where we're at in terms of our comfort level with what's coming up.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Luke. I really appreciate how you generously share your wisdom and knowledge with me and everyone. Just one last question before we wrap it up. How can the viewers and listeners find you, and what are the offerings that you have for them?
A good starting point, I think, is Somawise, the book, and those that prefer to have an audiobook, there's an audiobook version as well. So you can find Somawise on Amazon or Kindle or Audible. And then there's Somawise online and retreats, so somatic immersion retreats. Everything I do is related to the body, and more information on all that is available at somawisehealinglab.com.
Thank you. And I will put the link for everyone that needs to access it quickly. Well, once again, thank you very much. I appreciate
Thank you,
it as always, and I'll see you again.